All right, I am all caffeinated up and ready to go. Okay, so by the mid 8th century, Islamic forces had essentially taken over, I don't know, 90 plus percent of the Iberian Peninsula. The Christian Hispanic Roman people that existed there prior to the invasion, the native inhabitants, if you will, most of them were subjugated under Islamic auspices, under Islamic powers. Others, many fled to the north specifically to get away from the Islamic powers. And then obviously there were already people existing in the north in a kingdom known as the Kingdom of Asturias, and I think Galatia as well. I don't know if that came later though, if it existed from the outset. Anyways, the conflict between these two powers, I mean, it was basically endgame from day one. King Rodrigo, who was the king of the Visigothic people, he died at the first major sort of pitched battle between Islamic forces who had invaded from North Africa. And once he had died, his sort of army, any sort of armed resistance, quickly just sort of fell apart. I mean, there was just no organizational structure that existed that could repel the Islamic forces. And like I said, from essentially the beginning, so early mid 8th century, there was already a resistance of Spanish peoples in the north who were ready to not only fight and defend the kingdom of Asturias, but they had a vision and a goal of completely exiling or pushing out Islamic forces from their native homelands. And rather, by the way, if this is the first time you're seeing an episode in the series, I've done 2 episodes so far. I essentially predominantly just completely focus on Islam within Spain, Al-Andalus, how it came to be, the caliphate that existed there under the Umayyad dynasty. And now I'm shifting towards the other sort of side of the coin, the Christian peoples, the Spanish, the Hispanic Roman people. But rather than tell you the narrative, right? Like if you took a class or something, or like you can go watch, I'm sure, a handful of other AI history slop on YouTube that may or may not cover this period. Instead of telling you like, here's the date, and then this guy, he went there, and then this, like, I want to get away from that for a minute. When I study history, one of the ways that I sort of approach it, ideally, is I want to study not only who was there, who the actors were, but what they were like, what they believed in, maybe their religion, what their culture was like. And of course, this is a military history podcast, so I want to know how they were fighting, what weapons they were using, what motivated them to fight. And so I kind of want to put meat on the bone before showing you the whole skeleton. I don't know if that analogy makes any sense, but basically I'm doing it in the reverse that you would normally see it done in like a academic atmosphere. I'm going to tell you about the people, what they looked like, what it smelled like, some of the things they said, that in terms of how it spoke to their motivations. And then later down the road, I'm going to actually go back and explain the narrative of, okay, then the kingdom, there was a king and he took an army and they went into the Douro Valley and blah, blah, blah. So that's kind of how I'm going to do this. In this episode specifically, I want to do a couple things. One of the major pieces I want to cover is the concept or the idea of Crusades, what they were not, what historians, in my opinion, have gotten completely wrong, quite frankly. And, what was the involvement of the Spanish people in the Spanish Peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula, and what did that have to do with the idea of crusading? Did it play a role? What role was that? So on and so forth. So that's what this is going to be about. And then sort of the next layer on top of that is what motivated the individuals within Spain to want to go to war, not just kind of go to war for a few years, but literally commit themselves. I mean, it's crazy when you think about it. They committed themselves one generation after the other to fighting incessantly the Islamic forces with the ultimate goal of excising them out of the peninsula. And to me, it's like the mindset of that is incredible. And so I want to sort of unpack that and figure out what motivated them, what inspired them at the end of the day to commit to such a grand and impressive goal or mission set, if you will. So we're going to get into it. I'm Zach Masick. This is the Dead Warrior Society. I want to start firstly by saying this thesis that I have in terms of like what the Crusades were, what defines crusading in this period, is going to be, in my opinion, radically different than anything you've probably read before. And unfortunately, when we think about the Crusades, immediately I'm assuming your mind, like everybody's, goes to the war in the Holy Land, inspired or spurred by the Pope in the 12th century. And it's like we can't help ourselves. We focus laser like on those campaigns, right? There was many. I think there were 9 crusades to the Holy Land. And this to me is a mistake. One good, I think, anecdotal example of what I'm talking about, of where it's not just YouTube, it's everywhere. There's a fantastic lecture series that was posted up by a professor from the University of Houston. She did like 15 episodes, not episodes, but like lectures for her class on the Crusades. And I watched all of them. They're like an hour a piece. They're fantastic. It's a little dated, but it's worth watching. She only mentions the Reconquest of Spain, I believe, maybe a handful of times, and really goes into the details like once for 30 minutes. And to me, this is all wrong. If you want to understand the Crusades, you must understand and focus on what was happening in the medieval period in and on the Iberian Peninsula. I would argue that the war that was led by the Hispanic Roman Visigothic people against Islam in the 8th century, because remember, like I said, the resistance almost started immediately. I would argue that was the beginning of the Crusades. The concept or idea of crusading continued, it expanded, and it would crystallize and evolve almost constantly into what we know today as the Crusades in the 12th century. With that said, though, if we look at what crusading was in terms of like the why they were going on crusade, what you will see is the sort of loose definition fits perfectly into what was going on in Spain in the 8th century, like immediately. One sort of way to unpack this, maybe to help you understand what I'm really trying to say. Imagine if in 1,000 years you were studying or learning about World War II, and your professor only talked about the European theater of war during the World War II conflict, and he ignored everything going on in Japan, in Asia, the Pacific theater, North Africa, and he just focused in on Europe and said this was World War II. It was the Nazis and it was the Americans, the Canadians, the British, whatever. You're not understanding the full scope of what happened during that conflict. And it matters. And you need to know, obviously, in order to fully sort of parse out what happened during World War II and why it happened and why it mattered, you have to know about the Pacific theater. You have to know about the European theater. And so this is the exact same thing that's happening in academia in the Crusades. The Crusades were not just the Pope motivating some European knights and kings and lords and vassals to mount up, go to the Holy Lands, and try to reclaim and hold and maintain historical Christian lands. And obviously they argue that it was because the Christians were terrible and awful and attacked the Islamic forces or the Islamic states or caliphate, if you will, unprovoked, which is just unadulterated nonsense. But that's just one piece. It's an important piece, but it's just one piece. The Crusades encompassed an entire area from Britain to Spain to North Africa to the Holy Land for hundreds of years. And it ebbed and it flowed, and there were peaks and there were valleys. And a lot of that had to do with wars that were taking place on the European continent, right? You had the Franks and the English who were fighting each other, and then the Normans, and you had all these different people, and they went to war with one another for whatever reasons. And then every once in a while, the papacy would get their shit together and say, hey, we need to launch another crusade. So it would come and go, it would ebb and flow, like I said. But for the Spaniards, their crusade, which it was a crusade from day one, did not end. It did not stop. They fought amongst themselves, by the way, as we'll get into sort of more details later. But from the moment Islamic forces landed on the Iberian Peninsula, their crusade started, and it did not end for 800 years. Joseph O'Callaghan, in his book Reconquest and Crusade in Medieval Spain, wrote, quote, "When the Crusaders assaulted and captured Jerusalem in July 1099, the struggle between Christians and Muslims in Spain had been in progress for nearly 400 years." Now, most historians, by the way, would not claim that that was a crusade, excuse me. And I would simply suggest that they are wrong, I guess. Their sort of view or vantage point is not skewed, but it's simply mistaken, because again, the status quo is that the Crusades started in the 12th century and did not exist prior to that, really. Now, one of the themes if you've studied any Crusader history, is this idea that the Christians were awful and terrible and disgusting. And essentially they had attacked the Islamic Caliphate unprovoked. Muslims were just sort of living their normal everyday lives all throughout the Caliphate. And the Christians came in for really no good reason and just brutalized the Muslims. Obviously, this is just wildly inaccurate. And in my opinion, just revisionist dribble. Case in point, John Julius Norwich in his 1995 book, Byzantium, The Decline and Fall, concluded that Crusaders were, quote, one of the blackest chapters in the history of Christendom. And he makes the argument that Christians were spuriously motivated by loot and excused their grotesque behavior by claiming that they were acting on behalf of God. I'm going on a sidebar here. Bear with me. Any historian that is studying the pre-modern age, so ancient history, medieval period, whether it's in Europe or Africa or Asia or South, whatever, anywhere prior to like the 15th century or 16th century, if your critique of an army is that they took loot and booty from their defeated enemies, might I suggest that you are a fool? I don't know any army anywhere up until like really the last 100 years, and still to this day, armies loot and steal and take from their defeated enemies. But it was part of the process. That's what you did. And part of the reason for that was because most armies throughout all of human history very often did not have like a salary. Much of the motivation, and by the way, this is true in this period as well, was like, hey, we can only finance you so much to launch, but in order for you to pay your own salary, you're going to, whatever, if you are victorious, if you win, you get to take the monies from the defeated in whatever sort of shape, way, or form that may come in. I mean, and by the way, this is not just true of like Western armies. This is true of every army, from the Greeks, the Persians, the Romans, Muslims armies. Certainly, I mean, this is what Islamic armies did. Like that was their thing. They would raid, loot, take all the booty they could get their hands on, and then take humans as human chattel and sell them into slavery and make more money. Like that was their modus operandi for the vast majority of their conquests across the Levant into North Africa and into Spain. So the point of like boohoo Christian knights took some loot while they were on campaign, like, yeah, welcome to the medieval world, dude. With that said, there were certainly moments, put aside like the looting, Christians did do some really very grotesque, immoral things that even in that time, forget about what we think today, even in that time period, you had religious leaders in Rome and elsewhere who were fundamentally against what a lot of the Crusaders were doing. Usually it was like en route to the Holy Land. They would attack other Christians. They would attack Jews. They would take their money. They would harm them. There was rape. It was horrific. However, while it did indeed happen, and while it was indeed grotesque, like I said, these actions were a bug. They were not the feature. Meaning the Pope was not going to Christians and saying, hey, part of your obligation and duty and responsibility is to harm innocent civilians. Did individual Crusaders do that on their own? Yeah. But was it something that they were promulgating from all over Christendom? No, there's no evidence of this. Okay, so we need to establish now why Christians did the crusading. And this is true starting in the Iberian Peninsula all the way up until like the 14th century in the Holy Lands. The key sort of core reason, there's always many, there's never one reason for anything in history, but the primary reason, if you will, for the conquest, or not the conquest, but the crusading, kind of a conquest, was because they claimed that Christian land, number one, Christian lands had been stolen from them from the Islamic wave, the Islamic conquest, the Muslims, hundreds of years prior. Number one. Number two, they needed to lift the yoke off of the Christian dhimmis that were living in subjugation or second-class citizens within Islamic society. And the third would be, I would say, protecting pilgrims who are going to the holy sites, from taking pilgrims to Jerusalem. Now, that first reason, taking back Christian lands, that was literally the reason Hispanic, Spanish, Visigothic people from day one, what they were trying to facilitate on the Iberian Peninsula. I mean, if that is the core sort of explanation of crusading and why, what motivated them to do it, like I said, the Spaniards were doing that from day one. Therefore, I would argue that, yeah, they didn't call it a crusade necessarily, but it certainly was the beginning of crusading, if you will. Another point that I want to make, and again, I think it's really important, crusading, I think it is completely wrong to say crusading was a holy war against Islam. That is not true. At least I would argue it's not true. Did the Christian religion play an integral part in that process? Yeah, absolutely it did. It inspired them, it motivated them. They felt a sense of community among other Christians that were not from their region, right? So you had Germans and Franks and the Spaniards, you had the Hospitaller, you had these different military orders, they may have come from different places, but the glue that held them together was indeed their religion, was Christianity. However, there was nothing about their Christian religion that they said, hey, God is saying that we must go and kill or destroy Islamic powers. It was, hey, they took our shit from us and we need to go get it back now. Angus MacKay in his book, Spain in the Middle Ages, notes, quote, the successive generations who manned the frontier, this is in Spain, were not prompted by an overpowering sense of manifest religious destiny. True, the cult of St. James at Compostela gave focus to religious and crusading aspirations, but the religious life of the peninsula was unlike that of any other area of Europe. Arians, for a long period under the Visigoths, the later Catholics of Spain, were in perpetual and intense contact with Muslims and Jewish religions. Moreover, the Spaniards were aware that they were not waging war against barbarians, and the Iberian frontier was at all times the area of fruitful cultural contact. So, unlike the rest of Europe, Spain had become this sort of, there was a coalescence of people from all over the world that existed in Spain, even prior to the invasion of the Muslims, and then obviously just became even more diverse. So you have this wildly diverse peninsula, way more than the rest of Europe, and certainly more than North Africa, I would say. And because of that, the people of Spain, whether it was intentional or just sort of unintentional, but they realized in order to coexist, in order to survive, they had to accept people that did not look like them, did not speak the same language that they spoke, and certainly did not believe in the same religion that they believed in. And so this was on full display, by the way, in the conquest of Lisbon, which I'm going to get into in a later episode. But after the Christian forces were successful in taking the citadel, the Spanish sort of native people of the Iberian Peninsula had very little, if any, interest in treating the conquered poorly or subjugating them in any way. However, the French knights felt the complete opposite. They were what we would refer to today, I think, as religious zealots. They were brutal. They were violent. They were certainly belligerent. They did terrible things, up to and including rape, looting, murder. And at least in accordance with the historical text that we have, it appears as though the Spaniards, because again, they have to remain in this land. They have to continue to coexist with these people. And it's much easier for them to do so, to facilitate that, if they treat them more justly. Whereas the French are going to just run amok and do horrific things, but they don't have to deal with the consequences. They get to leave. But again, just to reiterate, in MacKay's quote, he specifically points out the fact that there was no sense of manifest destiny, as I think we would have referred to it today. And manifest religious destiny is literally what he says. So they were not going to war with Islam because they necessarily hated Islam. Whereas jihad, as we'll talk about in a second here, is radically different than the concept or idea of crusading, even though everybody and their mom in academia wants to couple these things together. We here at the DWS show want to and need to decouple them, because although yes, there was religious involvement in crusading, it was radically different than jihad. So just to drive home this point of what the Christian Spanish people were trying to do, according to a contemporary Islamic source from the time, obviously contemporary, Fernando I made the following reply to an Islamic king in Toledo who sought Fernando's help against the Muslim ruler of Zaragoza. This is Fernando speaking here. Quote, "We seek only our own lands, which you conquered from us in times past at the beginning of your history. Now you have dwelled in them for the time allotted to you, and we have become victorious over you as a result of your wickedness. So go to your own side of the strait," meaning the Strait of Gibraltar, "and leave our lands to us, for no good will come to you from dwelling here with us after today. For we shall not hold back from you until God decides between us. And again, notice the language here. He specifically says, we seek only our own lands which you conquered from us. I mean, I don't know how it could be any less, like, any more clear than that. Like, he is specifically pointing out, hey, this is our objective. You did this, and now we're doing this in response. And all we want is your land. We don't want to destroy you because you're not Christians. We don't really care. Do whatever the hell you want to do. But you came in unprovoked, by the way, and you took our lands from us. Our generations and generations of Roman Hispanic people have existed here for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And you came in and you took our shit, and we're just taking it back. And yes, by a divine hand of God, he sort of winks and nods at God here. God will be the arbiter. He will be the decider. But it is not the core reason as to why they are launching the Reconquest. Again, I'm sort of repeating myself here, but I really want to nail this point home. The Crusades were a territorial dispute that were indeed fueled by religious fervor. I think nearly all historians would agree to this point, by the way. Christianity played a vital role in inspiring and motivating a lot of these guys to go do these things, to go do these deeds, because it was dangerous. There was a good chance they were not going to survive, and it was costly. But again, the sort of religion, Christian motivations, if you will, were not at the core. They were they were an ancillary stimulus. So Callaghan notes, quote, when exhorting the people to take up arms against the quote unquote infidels, the enemies of the cross of Christ, a habitual description of the Muslims, preachers certainly stress the principal spiritual reward, namely the indulgence or remission of sins conceded to those participating personally or financially. As we've seen, Pascal II extended to the people of Spain Urban II's grant of remission of sins to those doing penitence by making the journey to the Holy Land. Therefore, popes consistently emphasized that this indulgence was equivalent to that of the Oriental Crusade. Christian leaders, religious leaders, kings, whomever, they had to manufacture reasons or sort of inspirational points that would incentivize individuals to take on the burdensome risk of leaving their lives and their families and going on a war, in the Holy Land. And this is certainly also is true within the Iberian Peninsula. And so one of the sort of things that they did was, in order to encourage these men to do this stuff, or these people, was the remission of sins by the Catholic Church. However, that was radically different than Islam's routine and prescriptive holy war known as Jihad. Despite what the historians claim, which is that the Crusades and Jihad are one and the same. One is just Christian, one is just Muslim. O'Callaghan notes, quote, the Islamic concept of jihad was a precept established in the Quran, a religious duty incumbent upon all male members of the community. Its aim was the subjugation of all people to the rule of Islam. This was an obligation that would continue until the rule of Islam had been extended throughout the entire world. Given the universal and unified nature of the Islamic community, in theory, there could be no holy war against other adherents of the faith. Warfare against non-Muslims might be interrupted by truces limited to a 10-year period, but there could never be permanent peace with them until they had finally submitted to Islam. Comparatively, Christian theology was just holistically and radically different. O'Callaghan notes this, quote, Christians clearly were aware of the use of violence at God's command in the Hebrew scriptures. But they also knew that fundamental message of the gospel is peace. Jesus seemed to condemn all warlike activity when he declared that, quote, all that take the sword shall perish by the sword. Early Christian writers condemned the use of force to spread the gospel and questioned or even denied the moral right of a Christian to follow a military career. Okay, just want to pause for 2 seconds. Already, we see this bifurcation between warfare within the sort of Islamic context and warfare within the Christian context. The sort of prophets or leaders, however you want to refer to Jesus and Muhammad, one effectively was saying, no, you must bring Islam to the world, and if you must use violence and the sword in accordance with jihad, that's what you will do, and it is a religious mandate. On the other side of the spectrum, you have Jesus, if you are a Christian, the son of God, not a prophet. And he was preaching the entire opposite. He was effectively saying never to use violence, and in particular, never to use violence in order to promulgate our religion, whatever, the true religion of Christianity. Now, will there be Christians in the future that do use violence in order to sort of promote or spread the gospels? Yes. Yeah, absolutely, that happened. However, that is not it is not in accordance with the religious doctrine, particularly in early Christianity. And the medieval period, all of these individuals who were Christian, who believed in the Trinity, they were wrestling with all of this. They were having to deal with the fact that they believed in this God, they believed in the Holy Trinity, they believed in Jesus Christ as their savior, and they believed in his gospel and his teachings. But it was very difficult because on the flip side of that coin, they lived in the real world. They lived in a world where there were threats everywhere, particularly external threats. And if they were not or could not even defend themselves, then the entire Christian ideology would simply cease to exist. Okay, driving on here. Nevertheless, there is no explicit condemnation of war or of the military profession in the New Testament. Christians were expected to avoid the shedding of blood under any circumstances, and especially in defense of religion. Once the empire became Christian, after the conversion of Constantine, these attitudes began to change as more and more Christians held civil or military positions, where they exercised the authority to condemn the guilty persons to death or to order men to kill in battle. In effect, Christians accepted the authority of the state and its coercive power. The purpose of warfare was to establish peace and order. To achieve that end, the state, like the individual, had an inherent and natural right to self-defense against both internal and external enemies. This is another major differential between Islam and Christianity. On the one hand, in Islam, you have both the state and the religious institution, and they are one organization. They are one institution. They work in conjunction with each other. It's not even each other. It's just one broad sort of ecosystem, if you will. However, within Christianity, within Europe, even though historians are dum-dums, and they suggest that Christianity was indeed infused into every aspect of Christendom throughout all of Europe, throughout all the kingdoms, that is simply not the case. There is clearly a defining line between religious authorities and secular authorities. And indeed, yes, of course, Christianity, the Gospels, the Scripture certainly spoke to those who were on the secular side of the fence. However, it was, as O'Callaghan points out, it was really up to them to facilitate any sort of use of violence against their enemies, both internal and external, in order to simply just exist in the world. And this is sort of one of the harsh realities of Christianity, and the difficulties is that you essentially are trying to follow, the living God, the Son of the God, Jesus Christ. But it's difficult because he's, again, through his teachings, he's saying do no violence, essentially. He's kind of like a hippie. But again, we live in a world where there are threats, and in order to defend their world, they had to exercise some kind of military force in order to defend themselves. And obviously later on, they're going to expand their territories. They're going to go into the New World. And they will indeed leverage the Christian religion, unfortunately, and the use of violence to coercively force others to become Christians. With that said, though, again, I would say that's a bug, not the feature, as O'Callaghan basically outlines here. Further evidence of what I'm trying to suggest is that more often than not, at least in this time period, and more specifically within the Iberian Peninsula, Spaniards, and I think I mentioned this a minute ago, they were just not interested in really converting Muslims. O'Callaghan writes, quote, "The purpose of war against Islam was not to convert the Muslims." Pause for 2 seconds there. The purpose of jihad was to, by force, coerce non-Muslims to become Muslims. So right there, you're seeing a clear differential. Aside from the challenge to Islamic rule by the 9th century martyrs of Cordoba and some Mos-Arabic apologetic treaties of the 11th and 12th centuries, Hispanic Christians were remarkably passive in confronting Muslim theology. Those who did make an attempt to preach the gospel among Muslims tended to come from beyond the peninsula. So essentially, just to sort of try to wrap this up nicely, Christians at this time had to sort of pretzel themselves or work or strain themselves to figure out a way of excusing the fact or the reality that they indeed not only had to go to war, but prepare for war. There were individuals that would have to dedicate their entire lives to the art or the act of warfare. And that may not fit nicely into their sort of religion or their religiosity or their beliefs, but it was just something that they had to do. And this is absolutely true within the Iberian Peninsula. So as time progressed, as the Spaniards continued to wage this sort of revolt, guerrilla type warfare, if you will, the rest of the European world and the Caliphate continued to exist. Sometime in the 12th or 11th century, the Christian world recognized the need to at least attempt to deploy some sort of force to bring back or reclaim what was once historically Christian territory, that was once part of the Roman Empire. And certainly in this, even in this period, even in the 11th century, many of the peoples that were existing within Christendom believed themselves to be a part of sort of the Roman lineage, if you will. And so they began to see what was going on in the Middle East, in North Africa, and in Spain as this incursion or invasion and subjugation of the Christian peoples. And therefore they need to respond and take back that land. That is simply a territorial dispute or response, I would commit. And obviously the sort of true, quote unquote, typical, I would say, narrative of crusading sort of started roughly around 1096. And again, Spaniards had already been committed to this crusading war effort within their homeland for hundreds of years. Again, all this demands a technical definition of what crusading, what defines crusade. How do we define what a crusade is? I would simply put within the context of this time frame, the sort of pillars of, war that meets the criteria of being a crusade is first and foremost reclaiming what were former Christian territories, number one. And number two, this is sort of later on, and it wasn't happening in the beginning. So I think it's a defining feature, but it's not a required feature, is the involvement of the papacy, is the involvement of the Holy Roman Empire, the church obviously within Rome. And they are the ones who really drive the Crusades. But again, they are sort of adopting what was happening in Spain prior to the Crusades and using that as sort of an inspiration to create incentive structures to promote another crusade in the East. And in the context of these ideas, again, territorial disputes trying to reclaim land that was once Christian, the Roman Spanish people were indeed the first ones in the fight. The French or the Franks would inevitably become, I would say, sort of the standard crusader throughout the crusade, what is typically considered the crusading period in the Holy Land. And they were an absolute powerhouse. But again, the Spanish were fundamentally the ones who inspired and led and motivated the rest of Europe to sort of get involved. And I don't even think that was so much them reaching out to the rest of Europe, to other peoples throughout Christendom and saying, hey, you should go fight this holy war. I think it was more of the Roman powers, other kings, seeing them as an example and then being motivated by that. Angus Mackey in his book, Spain in the Middle Ages, argues, quote, in short, the arduous crusade against Islam over the centuries had elevated Spain to the role of champion of Christian Europe against the infidel. Moreover, the Spaniards were at the bleeding edge of this confrontation between Islam and the Christian world. Indeed, there would be individuals, vassals, kings, knights that would deploy and go and mobilize to the Holy Lands and fight that war. But many of them, whether they won or they lost, they would just but they would just return home. And when they were, in Europe, the threat wasn't looming. And that was not the case in Spain. This was a constant state of warfare for these people that they were involved in for legitimately almost 800 years. And it really molded and defined their society into this frontier warrior culture where nearly every walk of life was either directly involved or indirectly involved. Mackay, again, he notes, quote, Much of the impact of the frontier, indeed, was due to the fact that successive generations were put through the same transforming disciplines. That is, they had to forego luxuries and adapt to those habits and institutions which the Reconquest and frontier life demanded. The existence of a permanent military frontier virtually meant that medieval Spain was a society organized for war, and it may be because of this that feudalism never developed properly throughout the peninsula. Okay, so one like good example of what he's sort of talking about here is ranching culture. So you have mobile livestock that you are raising in order to feed, society, if you will, or a small group or a large group, whatever. That started in Spain. One major positive aspect of raising livestock, cattle, sheep, whatever, is that they're mobile. And what that means is if there's a threat or a looming threat, or you know that there are raiders that are coming, you can have one of these castles all throughout Spain, and there were legitimately thousands of castles. And farmers, ranchers, knights, whatever you want to call them, they could go out on horseback, round up the cattle, and bring them behind the wall and defend their food supply. Whereas farms are obviously immobile, and they are easily destroyed. And this is where ranching culture comes from. So the ranching culture that exists in the United States that has frankly existed in the US for not only generations, but I would say hundreds of years at this point. All of that came from Spain. So knights would go out from a castle or from a municipality, and they'd go out into the frontier zone, which is sort of this no man's land, and they would raid along and in Islamic territories within Al-Andalus. And either going to or coming from a raid, they would move cattle from one pasture to another. And I'm going to actually go into this more in another episode, but it's just one of these things that was fundamentally, again, very, very different than the rest of Europe. The rest of Europe did not have this looming threat hanging over them at all times. And so when you have that sort of enemy that is so close, that is so near, that is a constant presence, you have to develop strategies to survive. And so one of the things they did was they built castles absolutely everywhere, and those were used effectively as garrisons to prepare, train, arm, plan, and deploy forces to go wage war or fight against Islamic forces. And also, like I said, they were used as sort of ranching communities in order to feed their people. Again, one of my favorite sort of go-to anecdotal examples of what I'm trying to illuminate is if you look at 19th century Anglo-Americans in Texas, they were very much dealing with a somewhat similar situation. Not so much that there was a reconquest, so to speak, but they lived out in a frontier zone. They had multiple enemies at the gate. You had the Comanche and Comanchera, and they had their own Comanche empire, and they would come and go and raid and steal horses and cattle and attack settlements. Simultaneously, you had the Mexican government, you had bandits that would come and steal livestock. And so what they ended up having to do was they created these paramilitary forces that would eventually, of course, turn into the Texas Rangers. And these were men who were ranchers, right? They raised cattle, they existed on the frontier, but simultaneously they had to facilitate a sort of military law enforcement type job or duty in order to protect their homes, their community, their society, because there was no larger state that they could call or police force that they could call. And so they would take it upon themselves to defend their settlements. And again, the cattle was mobile. So if they needed to bring everybody in a more defensive posture, they could do so by just moving the cattle in. Which, by the way, is not to say that they didn't have farms. They did indeed raise crops and so on and so forth. But a critical component of that way of life, of that culture, was cattle culture, was cowboys and ranching. One more thing I want to note too is how complex this whole thing was. It was not as though all of the sort of Spanish elite and Hispanic Roman people within the Iberian Peninsula only fought Islamic powers. It is far more complicated than that. You had eventually, particularly in like the 11th century and onward, frankly, you would have Muslim kings or emirs, governors, whatever you want to call them, and they would align themselves with Christians and vice versa. Even in the earliest days of the Caliphate, under the Umayyad dynasty, you had Christian Galatian mercenaries working for Al-Manzur, I believe, and some other emirs, right? They would hire them, and then, they would use them against other Christians. So you had Christians fighting other Christians while working for the caliphate in Al-Andalus. There were other situations in the midst of all this that you had different Spanish kings vying for power within the peninsula, like in the like halfway through the Reconquest, like 400 or 500 years into it. And these individuals would very often align themselves with other Muslims nearby. So you'd have a Christian and Muslim army fighting another Christian. So it was never really perfectly encapsulated in this sort of quote unquote Christians against Islam or Muslims, excuse me. But overall, the overarching theme, indeed, over the span of some 800 years, predominantly you had Christians that were slowly pushing out the Islamic rulership in Al-Andalus. And yeah, from time to time, there would be internecine warfare amongst the Christians, but that would sort of subside. The papacy very much would get involved later on and basically say, like, hey guys, like, you got to stop this shit. It's not, you got to, stop wasting time fighting amongst yourselves when you have a larger, more serious, pressing threat that needs tending to. And again, we're going to get into that history in a later episode. Angus McKay notes that, quote, for 5 years, for example, he, meaning referencing the Cid, who is a epic knight within the context, like the guy that sort of Spain to this day even celebrates for his efforts in the Reconquest, acted as the protector of Muslim Zaragoza, and the amounts he was paid for this protection could hardly have been less than 12,000 dinars per year, which previous protectors had exacted for the same service. So again, the Cid is a perfect example where you have this paradox of an individual who to this day is sort of a legend within Spain in terms of his representation and his success and the role that he played in the reconquest of Spain. He played a very minor role, but it was an important role. And the sort of inspiration that bled over after he died. But if you look at his career, at one point, he was fighting, not just fighting with the Muslims, but he was fighting in an effort in support of the Muslims of Zaragoza, for example. Okay, I'm going to pause here. And then in the next episode, what I really want to get into, what I'm really excited to talk about, are the weapons, the strategies, siege warfare, frontier warfare, what it looked like, what it sounded like, who was involved, and what it just all of the little things, the little details that get left out very often when you're reading these huge books like this, and they just want to tell you what happened year on year, and it just gets super complicated because there's a million Alfonsos and Fernandos, and they just it's so confusing. Anyways, with that said, thanks for joining me. I really do appreciate it. I'm Zach Masick. This is the Dead Warrior Society. We'll see you next time. Deuces.